and welcome to this week's episode of the Progressive Update, episode 4, and I'm Amos Elroy. Today I'm going to cover some criticism of Ilhan Omar and some criticism that was launched at AOC. The AOC criticisms were kind of funny, so we'll cover that. And then we'll talk about Bernie Sanders' campaign launch. I was there at Brooklyn College and posted some clips to YouTube, which you're welcome to look at. Basically, you can also subscribe to the YouTube channel if that's your preferred mode of consuming media. There's going to be clips and video content that I will post there that is not going to be in the podcast. So please look it up. It's basically my channel, The Progressive Update. And don't forget to ring the bell right next to the subscribe button so that you get updated whenever new video content or podcasts are being posted. And to top our program, we will have Josh Wilder talk about some of the changes in the latest edition of the Civ game, Civilization. It's a computer game, and apparently the new one has climate change in it. The first story is a little bit difficult and a little bit painful. It involves Ilhan Omar, who was so far received a lot of criticism about a recent thing that she's said. Here's what she said. I want to talk about the political influence in this country that says it's okay to push for allegiance to a foreign country. And I don't blame people who jumped in her defense necessarily. I disagree strongly with David Dowell, who I otherwise agree with 95% of the time. But I don't think they have the context of these remarks. And the problem is that Ilhan Omar has on several occasions put her foot in her mouth in regards to those things and really expressed things that were anti-Semitic tropes. In the past, she's said things like, Israel has hypnotized the world. May Allah awaken the people and help them see the evil doings of Israel. And the problem with those things is those things that she says are rooted in a language that has been used by anti-Semites in 20th century Europe and in other situations. And Jews who are aware of this history are finding it very hurtful, to say the least, to use that kind of language and make that kind of accusation. It implies that Jews are primarily aligned with another state, another nation, and not with the country they are citizens in. And those were accusations that were made by Nazis. I mean, the Jews were the promoters of communism in favor of Russia and things like that. And this is very problematic. It may have not been as problematic if it was a one-off expression, but she keeps tripping on these things, which either suggests that she has a mindset that is anti-Semitic. I hope that's not the case. Or it just means that she's susceptible, she is exposed to a lot of rhetoric from such sources that are anti-Semitic. Because this language is making its way from somewhere. As to the issue, Ilhan Omar has herself been attacked. There's been recently a poster showing her in front of the 9/11 World Trade Center bombing, and basically making the accusation that she's a traitor, which I find shameful and just as much of an issue. I have just as much of an issue with that as with any anti-Semitic remarks that may have been made. And really, you have to be, if you're going to protect one, you have to protect the other. You cannot pick and choose which of these expressions of ethnic hatred you will ignore and which ones you will go after. Now, David Dole in his remarks has made the connection or put it in the context of the BDS movement and the fact that a lot of states have banned companies from being involved in it. So basically, what that means is that there is a movement that has appealed for boycott of Israel, widespread boycott of Israel, and several states have balked at that and said that we will not allow companies to do so. If they're doing so, if they're involved in this boycott movement, any agency, any state agency will not do business with them, which has led to some people's firing and stuff like that. There's a constitutional question about it. The proponents of these anti-BDS movement laws have made the point that it is an extension of the laws in the US that say that no company can engage in a foreign boycott movement. And the reason for that is that the companies are not supposed to create foreign policy, but are financial institutions. The objectors to that say that it's a matter of freedom of speech, and that anybody who wants to boycott anything should be able to do so. Ironically, the people who state that are also opposed generally to the fact that the U.S. Supreme Court considers companies as individuals. And I don't think that companies are individuals. It's a very different thing if an individual chooses to boycott, say anything that they want, and whether a company does so. Either way, I'm completely open to people arguing on the facts and arguing on the content. That is a separate issue, and we could have a discussion of that. But Ilhan Omar's expression was not related to this individually, and it was made, from my understanding, to a general position of defending herself against those who say that she's that she was anti-Semitic in the past. It relates more to her point that the pro-Israeli lobby has affected U.S. politics in a way to force allegiance to a foreign country through monetary means. In other words, politicians are bought to subvert companies and citizens' allegiance to also be to Israel, which is, in my opinion, an absurd assertion. And Omar's assertion that the pro-Israel lobby has corrupted U.S. politics is a little bit disingenuous, because there is no lobby by the State of Israel. There are groups that have lobbies in the United States that are associated with Israel. Some of them are Christian, evangelical, some of them are Jewish, some of them are liberal, and some of them are right-wing. For example, the AIPAC is a right-wing organization that supports Netanyahu and his policies and mostly right-wing conservative ideology. J Street is one that is liberal and even progressive in many ways. And both are supporting the existence of Israel and are lobbying on that ideology. So to paint it all as a matter of allegiance, blind allegiance, and corruption of the US political system is problematic, to say the least. And we're talking about US citizens. They have equally the right to support their positions as does Omar or anybody else regarding Islamic or Muslim aspects. And the other thing is, Omar has never, to the best of my knowledge, expressed any concern about the Saudi lobby that is actually buying the US allegiance, so to speak, with money. It is a autocratic government that's spreading terrorism across the world, that's attacked and waging a ruthless war in Yemen that has caused hunger and severe human misery. And we're supporting it strictly because there is business to be made, personal in the case of Trump, or national in the case of weapon and other sales. And that has never been an issue for Omar, as far as I know. At least we have not heard it in the same tenacity that she's expressed opposition to Jewish lobbying or whatever. And that's problematic for me too. Of course, I like to root for progressives. I hope that this is in error. I always try to give people the benefit of the doubt. The fact that she's repeatedly stepped in it is not very encouraging, but let's see. And I don't expect people like David Doyle to be aware of these contexts and the language that's being used. But hopefully once it's explained and displayed, they will be more cognizant of it. I greatly recommend an article in The Atlantic called The Ugly History of Dual Loyalty Charges. And in that article, they express the history of these claims that initially were used against Catholics. There were times that US citizens made the point that Catholics should be prevented from coming into this country because they would be a fifth column for the Vatican. So that, and then the Sharia law argument that should apply to Muslims. There was recently claims by people that were attempting to ban Muslims just purely on basis of the fact that they might have allegiance to Sharia law and to Mecca, which is equally outrageous. This brings me to the next topic, which is AOC's criticism. And here, the Daily News and other publications have launched this article attacking AOC that she has spent a considerable amount on Uber rides. And so her behavior was, as they state, hypocritical. They stated that when she was doing work for her campaign, she often took car rides, even though she had a subway station close by. Which is kind of silly, because when you think about it, the fact that you have a subway station close to you doesn't mean that the destination would have a subway station close. And it doesn't indicate anything really. It's the point that AOC is trying to make is that our society is wired in a way right now that make use of energy conserving methods and mechanisms just more difficult. And she wants to transform our economy so that this becomes second nature to everyone. She's never claimed that she's the perfect person, and that would be a ridiculous requirement on anyone to have to bike to work if they are of opinion that the Green New Deal needs to happen in order to save the planet from a wider catastrophe. In fact, you can ride to work every single day and save on car rides, and this would be offset by a single plane ride from Washington, D.C. to New York by an individual. So we really need to take a look pragmatically of what it means to transform our economy, not try to make it like a personal thing. It's just ridiculous, in my opinion, to make this a personal attack. Bernie Sanders launched his campaign in Brooklyn College. I was there along with many others. There were thousands of people there to greet him. I understand that the Chicago event has been likewise successful. And this is just coming out of the gate. It's not even campaign time. Most of the campaigns haven't even started. And clearly, Sanders has already an advantage on the ground. I think that the fact that there's so many people that are there to root for Sanders to start running his campaign is just an indication of the difference between him and most of the other candidates. And to me, really, this indicates that people have not lost the trust in him. They still don't see themselves supporting others as much as him. And this is due to the fact that he has so solidly stood by his agenda. He has not made it more central. He's not tried to tamper with it. He believes what he believes, and he's fighting for it, and people respond to that. And I say, take no substitutions. Any one of these candidates that supposedly is now more progressive is just taking their cues from his success. They have not had that courage to go there themselves, and the fact that he's shifted the entire party, and in many cases the entire US population, in his direction, in the direction of concern for the environment, in the direction of concern for income inequality and the problems with our education and the higher requirements that are constantly mounting for higher education, as well as healthcare for all, is just clear. So the energy at the event was palpable. It was just incredible. It was intoxicating. It was kind of like plugging straight into 2016 and its enthusiasm for Sanders at that time. It's almost like for an alcoholic to take a chug from a bottle after a long time, but in a good way. And his speech and you can find it on YouTube, in many ways shows you the difference between him and the rest of the candidates. He is the one candidate that clearly understands and makes the point that is not about him, it's about a movement, and it's not going to be up to him to change all the things that he's advocating, but jointly, everyone supporting this will have to do their part. And that is a big difference in conceptual approach, because it's not about who is going to win the presidency. He's not pretending that somehow he's going to be able to transform everything single-handedly. On the very contrary, he's staking everything on being able to continue the development of this grassroots movement, and he has done a great deal up to now to create that movement. In fact, there's been 1 million people that are already signed on to his campaign, which means that straight on we will have people in all states ready to take leaflets, ready to run around, ready to support whatever it is, and protest and attend town hall meetings. So that is the difference, and that is why so many people support Sanders as opposed to the various other options. I highly recommend going to one of Sanders's rallies. It's a very special atmosphere. So I'm sure you will enjoy it, and you will be able to hear him unfiltered. Next with me today is Josh Wilder. He's civil rights on a civil rights commission in Pittston, PA, and in the PA Mental Health Planning Council. And we'll have a discussion about the new Civ game, computer game that recently has introduced climate change aspect. Hi, Josh.
Oh, hi, Amos. How are you doing?
Good. So tell me a little bit about what you found regarding Civ.
Sure. So, for those who aren't familiar with Civilization, it's a turn-based strategy game, and players start with settlements in 4000 BC, I believe it is, and they guide their civilizations up to the current era and beyond. They have to deal with resource gathering, expansion, dealing with rival nations, and things of that sort.
It's basically a multiplayer computer game, right?
Yeah, there's a multiplayer option. I think most people play it single player though,
Hmm.
because it's a very time intensive game. So it's
Right.
nice to play 20 or 30 minutes here and there, save, and then come back to it at a later time.
Hmm.
But the civs, as they're called, they're led by notable historical figures. In Civ 6, which is the latest version of the game, some of the leaders are Teddy Roosevelt for the US, Victoria for England, and Augustus for Rome. So you can see that the developers pull their leaders throughout history. And each leader has some unique units and buildings to give players a feel for their history and a bit of their culture as much as they could. But it's relatively simple, but they try. And so Civ 6 has typically been a pretty straightforward game. It's fun, but not necessarily very complex. But the most recent expansion added some new elements to the game that add quite a bit of complexity to it. The title is called Rising Storm, but players immediately started calling it Civ 6 Climate Change. And that's because there's actual climate change in the game. And as far as I know, that's pretty new to video games. So there are tornadoes, sandstorms, blizzards, floods, droughts, violent thunderstorms, tornadoes, and volcanoes. And all those things are new to the Civ franchise. And it's interesting because they've really made an effort to give players, to me, this is common sense, but I guess it's not common sense to everybody, kind of a crash course in climate change.
Hmm.
And one way they did this is in Civ games of the past, fossil fuels were more of a currency than anything else, but now you can power your cities with fossil fuels. So you can have coal plants that burn coal, oil that burns oil, and that puts CO2 into the atmosphere. And as the CO2 enters, levels rise, global temperature rises, chances for flooding increase, chances for droughts increase, violent storms, and eventually you get to a point where the ice caps start melting and sea levels rise, and coastal cities are greatly affected by that.
So how do you counter that as a player?
Well, it's real. This is really interesting, and I'm not sure if they planned it this way, but the way it works is your Civ is always the strongest because you're a human being, and the computer can only do so much. So, the very first game I played, I went nuts with fossil fuels, and so all the other nations did the same thing. And actually, we burned so many fossil fuels that ocean level was rising at dangerous levels around the year 1600. So
Oh, wow.
that's, yeah, I thought it was interesting. And in future games, I did the opposite. I didn't really burn fossil fuels. I tried to work my way up to renewable energy. And what I noticed is that other civs kind of followed suit. And that, I don't know if it was intended, but it's really interesting because I draw a lot of correlations between that and the United States in some ways, where other nations look to us to see what we're doing. And if we're not doing anything, some nations don't feel that they should do much either, which is a problem.
Hmm. So you see
Um,
it in a US centric kind of perspective as far as the game is developed.
yeah, I don't think they intended it, but I like to think that they did.
Now, if you do play it in, I don't know if you had that experience of playing it in a multiplayer environment, but if you're burning more fuels and somebody else is not, or vice versa, is there any way that you would be able to coordinate with them or pressure them to follow suit?
Kind of. And this is another real world parallel that we're experiencing at this time. There's a World Congress, which is kind of the subversion of the UN, and you can draft resolutions to not necessarily punish other civs for burning too many fossil fuels, but incentivize them to not. But ultimately, it those resolutions don't have much teeth, and the civs are going to do what they want to do. So, and I feel that's kind of the situation we're in today in the real world.
Unfortunately.
But there's offshore wind farming, solar farming, hydroelectric dams, and it really teaches the player that renewable energy has more benefits than just going green to say you're going green. Solar farms, for example, give hammers and gold, and that might be a little too much inside baseball for people who aren't familiar with Civ,
Hmm.
but I think you know it, you get it, and I like to think that that highlights the economic benefits to solar. But again, I might be attributing too much to their intentions there.
And how hard or easy is it to avoid complete meltdown climate change? Is it something that is just supposedly dependent on newer technologies, or is it something that actually takes some toll or changes things considerably in your nation?
So if you build your empire based on fossil fuels, you have to transition off those fossil fuels, and you can do that by you have these industrial zones where you produce your energy, and you can do that by retrofitting them basically to go nuclear, for example. But I think the lesson they want people to take away from the game is that the climate change that happens in the game, it's gradual at first, but then it gets to the point where it's out of your control. And if you don't do something before it's no longer within your means to do something, then you're at the whim of the planet, basically.
Hmm. which unfortunately sounds very realistic. But
Yes, very.
all right, well, that's a very interesting development, and thank you very much for discussing it with me, and I appreciate it, Josh. Thank you.
You're welcome.
And guess what? You've wasted another perfectly good half hour with me, Amos Elroy, on the progressive update. Don't forget to subscribe. Don't forget to share if you like the content. And if you're on Twitter, just tweet with the hashtag progressive update and you can talk to me if you have any questions, suggestions, anything. All right. Talk to you later. Bye bye.